create the scope, and then we use the scope to get the service for the application DB context, and then we migrate the database. That's fine, we've seen that kind of thing before. Then we go and get the user manager service that's provided by ASP.NET's identity, not identity server. This is coming from ASP.NET's identity because that is the service that's responsible for user management, and it does provide us with a user manager service so that we can add users and get users from our database, and this is using the application user as a type. So first of all, we go and check to see if we have a user named Alice in our database, and if Alice is null, then we're going to attempt to create a new user called Alice with a username of Alice and an email with that email address, and we're going to automatically confirm that email because we're not going to be adding an email service so that we genuinely can confirm users' email addresses on this training course. That is something you would need to do separately if you were interested in adding that functionality. And then we go ahead and create the user using the user manager with a hard-coded password, and then we check to see if the result has succeeded, and if not, we throw an exception. Now if we do have the results, then we're going to go and add some claims for this user. And remember, a claim is just something that the user says about themselves. So this person, for instance, would claim that their name is Alice Smith. They would claim their given name is Alice, and they would claim their family name is Smith. Now we don't need all of these claims for what we're doing here, so I'm just going to remove the extra ones apart from the name. We only really need, for our purposes, the user's name so that we can display it in the user interface, and the username is the unique thing that we'll use for things like the seller property and the winner property, so we know which user has done what. And if that doesn't work, then, or that user already exists, then we just log something out to the console. Then we do the same for Bob, and we create a new user object for Bob, same thing, and I'm just going to clean up the claims that have been provided inside here just as an example. And note that we can create any kind of claim we want. This isn't a standard claim location, but we can add custom claims in here as well if we want to do so. But I'm going to remove those. I'm just going to keep the name property or the name claim and remove the other stuff, simply because we're not going to use it in our application. And what I'm also going to do is, before we attempt to create the users, because we're going to add this method into our startup and it's going to run every time we restart our application, I'm just going to check to see if we already have any users in our database, and if we do, I'm not going to execute any of this code below this. So I'm just going to say if the user manager dot users dot any, then I'm simply going to return from this method. And looks like VS Code is going to need a kick because it doesn't really understand what users is. So I'm just going to reload the window, the standard trick for VS Code misbehavior, and make sure that I can get the information about the objects that I've tried to access here. And if I hover over this, then okay, now I start to see some problems, and that's because VS Code was misbehaving, and I removed some things it said it didn't need, but it really did need them because now we see the errors. And I need to bring in, using Microsoft Entity Framework Core, and I need to bring in using Microsoft ASP.NET Core Identity as well. And if we take a look at the users now we can see that this is part of the user manager, and we can use the any to see if there are any users in our database. And the user manager comes with quite a bit of functionality that we can access. If I just add a period, I can see all of the methods that the user manager supports, and it does give us access to the users table in the database once we've created it. So a whole bunch of stuff that we can do with the user manager as well in this case, although our needs are quite simple just now. And it's claiming I've still got some errors, so let's just take a look and see what else I need to add in. And I was tricked by VS Code into thinking that I didn't need this stuff, but it looks like I am going to have to add this in and say using identity model for JWT claim types. And I'm also going to need to bring in something for the logging as well. And let's see, are we clean? Yeah, now we're clean and we've got a clean class. So with this seed data, let's go across to the program class and take a look at the program class for the identity service. And we're going to remove the command line based seed functionality, and we're just going to replace it with a line to seed the data inside here. So I'm just going to say seed data and ensure seed data and pass through the app as a parameter. So this is going to execute every time we restart identity, which is fine. It's going to check to see if there's any users in the database. If there is, then this will not run or try to add extra users into that database, and then we just run our application. Now what we also have inside this identity service project is in the data folder inside migrations, we already have a migration to populate the tables from ASP.NET Identity, but we're going to need to remove this because this migration was created using a SQLite provider, and what we can see inside here is some SQLite specific annotations, and they will cause problems if we try and use this with a Postgres database provider. So we need a migration specific for Postgres, and we're going to create that now as well. So we'll remove the migrations folder completely. So I'm just going to right click and delete this entire folder, and then we can go ahead and create a new migration based on the Postgres SQL provider. So let's see. I'm just going to stop the application. What I've done there has probably caused it to fail. And please do make sure you stop your identity service from running, because when we create a new migration, that service does have to be stopped. So I'm going to say .NET EF migrations add, and I'm just going to call it initial create. And we need to specify an output directory of data migrations so that this new migration gets created inside that data folder. If we don't specify an output directory, the command will still work, but you'll just have a migrations folder in the root of your project rather than being located inside the data folder. So I'll just press return to execute that command, and we'll see if this works. And okay, so I've got a warning, and it tells me that the Entity Framework Tools version 7.07 is older than that of 7.0.8. I don't think that's anything, well, I know that's not anything to worry about, but if we do want to ensure we don't get that error in future or that warning in future, we can just say .NET Tool Updates and say .NET-EF-G and press return, and that should get us to 7.08, and we won't see that next time we use this tool. So let's take a look at the migration that has been created. And if we go to the migration file, then we can see inside here that we now have a migration for a Postgres database, and we'll see some variances with the column types, and any specific Postgres annotations are going to be inside this file as well. So this gives us a whole bunch of tables. One's for ASP.NET users that contains user-related information, the ID, the username, the password hash of the password they used when they register, and other information about the user. We've also got a table for claims, role claims, and user claims, and user logins, and user roles, and user tokens. And the only one that we'll really be interacting with is the ASP.NET users table on occasions, and that's where our users are going to be stored. Now there's one more bit of configuration I need to do before we move forward, and we'll need to go back to the hosting extensions class, something that I should have done a little bit earlier but didn't do. And what we need to do is, because we are running identity server over HTTP, then we need to make a small change to our cookie configuration so that we don't use same site strict when we return a cookie from identity server. So just after the add ASP.NET identity, we're just going to say builder.services, and we're going to say configure application cookie, and we're going to pass in some options, and we're going to say options.cookie.samesite equals, and we're going to say samesite-mode.lax. And if we don't do this, at some point we'll start to run into problems. I don't think we'll see an issue with this until we get to the client application stage, but this is required for us to do to get this functionality working when using HTTP. So you should have your Postgres SQL Server up and running. We do need that up and running. It says my session has expired, but only for the login functionality at the top here. We don't need to be signed in to use Docker Desktop. So we've got Postgres up and running, and that is fine. And we should be able to restart our app now. And I'll say .NET watch and press return, and hopefully this will start successfully, and it has not. And the reason for that is because I have not changed my connection string to use a PostgreSQL connection string, and it's still using a SQLite one. So that's something we need to correct. So let's go to the app settings.json, and we'll need to make a change inside there. And this is a SQLite connection string, no good for SQL Server, of course. And I'm just going to go back to the app settings development.json for the auction service, and just to make sure I get the connection string accurate, I'm just going to copy this connection string. Because we are using the same database server, I'm not going to create individual database servers when we're using the same database server technology. That would be an unnecessary load on our development machines. And whilst each project or each service is going to have its own database, we are going to share the database server whilst we're in development. And I'll go back to appsettings.json. We don't actually have an appsettings development.json in our identity server project. We could create it, but I'm just going to use appsettings.json in this case. And instead of the database being called auctions, I'm going to change that to use identity. And now we should be able to restart our application, and it should run successfully. But let's give that another go. And sure enough, this time it does work. And what we should find, if we go and take a look at Postgres, and we'll just refresh the items in here. And maybe I also need to edit the connection, because I believe when I created this connection, I only asked for the auctions database. And let's see, how do I edit the connection? And it looks like there's an option here, but I'm not convinced that's going to take two databases. So let's go and create a new connection. And the host name is going to be local host. The password or the user is going to be Postgres, and Postgres PW. For the password, the port is 5432. We'll use a standard connection, and I'm going to go for the identity database, and I'll just say identity DB as the name of this connection. So inside here we should have our identity database, and inside public we should see all of the tables that have been created. And ASP.NET users, if we select the top 1000, we should find that we have our two users that we created via the seed data, and we can see Alice and Bob have been added to our database here. Perfect. We do store the password hash inside here, by the way, but this has been hashed many times over using a unique salt. And even though the passwords for these two users are identical, we can see that the hash is different for both of these users. And remember, we're pretty much using out-of-the-box stuff here provided by Identity Server and ASP.NET Identity. They don't release these products in an insecure state that we then need to go about the business of tweaking them to make them secure. That would make no sense. So we're okay with how this works in terms of where we're storing the password hash for these users. So now that we have some users, let's go check to make sure that we can actually log in as one of the users. So I'm going to click on to see the claims for the current session. And the username in this case is Bob, I'm going to test with. And the password is PASS123$. That's the default password that we created when we seeded the data. And we can see the authentication cookie that's returned along with the claims for that user. If we take a look at the console inside Chrome and take a look at the application, then inside here, what we will see inside our cookies is we've got an ASP.NET Core Identity Application cookie. And this is encrypted stuff. We can't make any sense of this. And that's the value of what we get back from Identity Server. So it recognizes we have a session with Identity Server. And we've also got an anti-forgery token here as well. If we log out, we'll retain the anti-forgery token, but the identity one will disappear, and I'll just click on Bob Smith